think we're all back. All right. So, who wants to share what was discussed in your breakout room? So we have the obstacle for producing the text. We have the connections made between all three readings, and your gifts, attributes, and talents, how they can lead to you fulfilling your purpose. What was discussed in the breakout rooms?
I actually have something to say about. Um, I had made a connection with one specific like sentence that was in the text. Where he had said he was talking about like religion. You know how the other week we are talking about religion and spirituality. Well, he had actually said something about the topics within Christianity. He said all of these topics were presented with a good dose of Christianity and its temperamental God who forced everyone to live in constant fear of his wrath. So that's one thing that we had spoke about in class is that like a lot of religions, like people who follow religions are really like in fear of like of messing up due to like, going to hell or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I wrote that down in my notes, so that's a very good call out. That's something I noticed as well. Who else wants to comment either on their gifts or attributes or the greatest difficulty in producing the text? So, the greatest difficulty in producing the text or your gifts or attributes, real quick. So, Lynette, what did your group discuss about the greatest difficulty in producing the text or obstacle?
We were all kind of having trouble understanding it, but we didn't really discuss much.
So, what did you guys? What questions did you pose if you had difficulty understanding it? What was your conversation then?
Wait, sorry, what was the question?
So, if you guys had difficulties understanding it, what was your guys' conversation in the breakout rooms? What did you guys talk about then?
Like I said, we didn't really discuss much. I apologize.
Who was in your breakout room?
Um, I don't quite remember. I don't know if they want to speak up and say who they were, but I don't really remember their names exactly. I apologize.
Okay, I appreciate you not snitching. I guess you staying true to snitch to street code. Um, Maria, what was discussed in your group? Maria Perez Munoz.
For what question?
Yeah, what was discussed in your breakout group?
For what question or any?
Any of them?
Well, for the readings, we put that it was like quite different because the other two were based on like instructions and stuff, and this one was like completely different. How I talked like about education and how he moved to the States without knowing English, and how like um he was like honest in his reading when he didn't necessarily have to be honest.
Okay. Victor, what was discussed in your breakout group?
Yeah. What was discussed was more about how he wasn't or he wasn't able to mm, damn, I had it, but let me see. So,
Victor,
can you come
who?
back to me?
Yeah, who was? Let me ask you this: who was in your group? Do you remember anyone in your group?
I don't actually. I don't remember the names.
I was in his group.
Okay.
Oh yeah, Josh. I know it was with a J.
Yeah. I know I just
Oh, I
went.
was.
It was more like.
What do
Oh,
you want
sorry.
So,
to? Okay.
Johnson, what did you guys discuss?
Another thing we discussed about like the first question, the author's greatest obstacle when producing the text was like he couldn't exactly translate what he was trying to say from like um like great points within his culture in English. So he was basically saying like, oh, there's a few things that I want to say, but they don't translate with the same emotions that they do in my like his foreign language.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, he says there's a violence that ensues when you translate from one culture to the next culture. So absolutely. Let's do this. Let's jump into my notes for the text. Once I'm trying to be cognizant of time because I don't want to go over. All right. So this is the book that the reading was pulled from. What you guys read was the introduction to the book. The book is titled "A Water in the Spirit: Ritual Magic and the Initiations in the Life of an African Shaman." The author of the text, Maladoma Patrice Somé, he is an intellectual out of Burkina Faso. He's also a spiritual advisor. Um, how I was introduced to the text, actually. I was doing my undergrad at Cal State LA. I was in a Pan African Studies class, and we had a guest speaker. The guest speaker was actually the current chair of the Pan African Studies Department, Dr. Nana Lawson Bush. And he had us do this exercise in class where he divided the class in two groups. One group was the red team, the other group was the blue team. And we were tasked with the assignment of coming up with a system that would completely oppress or subjugate the other team, right? So if you're on the blue team, you have to come with a system that will completely oppress or subjugate the red team. If you're on the red team, you have to come up with a system that will completely oppress or subjugate the blue team, right? And after we've gone through the exercise, he's asking us about what we thought about the exercise. And I said, it seems like to me this exercise is symbolizing the experiences between Africans and Europeans. And for Africans, the only way to overcome this oppression and the system of oppression is to get back to the African institutions that we were originally practicing prior to European invasion, right? And he says, that sounds great, but I don't believe that your mind could really understand the vastness of what Africa is. And I would encourage you to read this book to get you a better understanding of what goes on in Africa. Like, okay, bet. So I went and grabbed the book, I read it, and he was absolutely right. What I read within the page of the book, it fucked me up, it blew my mind, right? And in passing, in the introduction, Maladoma talks about his grandfather's burial ceremony. And he doesn't give you too much details, but in the actual book, he goes into great details about that ceremony. And the ceremony is one of those things that we really can't grasp in our understanding of life here in the West, right? And I'm going to tell you why. So as he articulates his grandfather's burial ceremony, his grandfather makes his transition, right? Or what you guys may call he dies. About 3 days passes, and then the community elders come and they go into the grandfather's hut. They have these big, vast bowls, if you will, right? And they're mixing these herbs and these different elements into the bowl. And they start to stir the bowl. And as they stir the bowl, like a smoke starts to fill the room, right? And then Maladoma says he kind of looks and he sees the elders walk away from the bowls, but the bowls continue to mix by themselves, right? And then he notices as they're mixing by themselves, they elevate and they go on the roof. So they come from the floor to the roof, but they continue to mix on their own, right? The elders get the contents of the bowl and pour it around the grandfather's bed. Sprinkle some dust on the grandfather, and the grandfather sits up out of his deathbed. He's been dead for 3 days, okay? So once the grandfather sits up, more elders come. They're playing drums, and they say chants, right? And one of the elders whispers into the grandfather's ear, and the grandfather gets up off of his deathbed and starts to dance. And he proceeds to dance for 2 miles into his ceremonial burial ground, right? So for us in the West, that's beyond reason, right? Because in the Western world, once you die, you're dead. There's no coming back. There's no getting up. There's no dancing, right? But for Malidoma and the Dagara, this is a normal occurrence, right? And this is why Dr. Bush says what goes on in Africa may be beyond our reasoning, right? So in the book, in the opening pages of the introduction, he tells you his name, Malidoma Patrice Somé, which means to be friends with enemies, right? Or strangers. And he says that the Dagara believe that every individual comes into this life with a special destiny. And a person's life's project is therefore inscribed in the name that he or she carries, right? So from a Dagara standpoint, Marable, anytime that you would hear your name, it's designed to help you realize, remember, and actuate what your purpose on this planet is, right? Every time you hear your name, Kaylin, it would be to remind you of what your purpose is on this planet, right? So it works almost as a mantra, right? So you cannot forget why you were brought here. So we're far removed from the Dagara society, right? So oftentimes when we assign names in the West, they do not connotate a person's purpose. They're just names, right? You may be named after somebody, but it doesn't dictate what your purpose is. So the way, for me, that I understand this notion of purpose is the gifts, the talents, and the attributes that you have been given by the Most High, by the Creator, by God, Allah, Yahovah, whatever you so choose to call that being, right? And he articulates that the greatest obstacle that he had in producing the text, to Jocelyn's point, was the inability to transfer African phenomenon into English language, because there's no language in English for the things that happen in Africa, right? So what I just articulated to you about his grandfather's burial ceremony, we don't have a word for that in English, right? That's just so far beyond the English conception that we don't even have words to name that. So that becomes the difficulty in trying to produce the book for Malidoma. And I'm gonna skip past this point because it was already articulated in the earlier, as far as, you know, this Christian God that wants to be feared. But he does go on to say, I know especially why my people have such a deep respect for old age, right? So in the Dagara community, the elders, old folks, right, and the babies have the highest reverence in the community. And they hold the highest reverence because both the elders and the babies are the closest tied to the ancestors. Why would I say that the elders and the babies are the closest tied to the ancestors?
I think that babies just kind of came from, and then elders are going to.
Yep, exactly, right? So the baby, when they're in the womb, they're still connected to the ancestral plane, right? And that connection is severed once they come out of the womb into this life, right? The elders, as you get closer and closer to your transition, or to becoming an ancestor, or dying, or becoming an ancestor, right? So you're closest tied to the ancestors when you're an elder and when you're a baby. And because of that closeness, you have a direct line of communication from the ancestors. So in the Dagara, whatever the elder says is held with high reverence because they believe that's a message from the ancestor. Whatever a baby or a child articulates, they believe is a message from the ancestor. So they have very high importance. Also, a thread that you found in Ptahhotep, right? Because of his old age, the wisdom that he was afforded allowed him to write those proverbs. But he also goes on to say why a strong, functioning community is essential for the maintenance of an individual's sense of identity, meaning, and purpose, right? So it's not really on you by yourself to fulfill your purpose. The community is going to help you do that. The community is going to also help you understand who you are. It's going to give you your identity, right? There's a tension at play within the readings. What is that tension? What do you guys think that tension is at play within the reading? That tension, that beef, that division, that rift, however you want to articulate that. What is it? And you can also think about, if you think about what Malidoma's name means, will give you some insight into the tension at play. What does Malidoma's name mean?
To be friends with strangers or enemies.
So who is the stranger or the enemy, Lynette?
Like the West, like not African society.
So the tension would be between who then? The West and what?
Kind of like what you articulated earlier, how we can't really describe in like our Western culture, like African cultures and traditions. It's kind of that tension between the two.
Yep. So the tension, the cultural tension between the Western world and indigenous African societies, right? And yes, you're correct that that tension played out by him being stolen from his homeland and taken to the French Jesuit missionary school, right? But he says his ancestors, his elders were watching as the Europeans came in and started to invade Africa. And as they invaded Africa, they brought death and destruction, right? They decimated African lands, they decimated African cultures, they decimated the Dagara lifestyles, right? And then as Malidoma continues to fulfill his life mission and he goes to college and he goes to life out here in the West, to live out here in the West, he notices a shift that takes place. He knows that the European is not more so concerned with colonizing Africa, but now preserving African culture. And he says that anytime that one culture starts talking about preservation of another culture, that other culture is become an endangered species, right? And to me, this is very profound because what we see and how you see this manifest, if you go to the British Museum, it's filled with African artifacts, right? What the British will tell you, well, we took these to preserve this ancient African culture, right? But what they won't say is how they went in there, they created wars, and because of those wars, they stole that material, right? So this in culture that they're trying to preserve, they already damaged it, they already decimated it in order to steal their artifacts to quote unquote preserve them, right? So Malidoma is attentive to this phenomenon and how this shapes up. I was also very attentive to his talisman and the work that his talisman did, right? That little bag that he got that held all of his magic artifacts that allowed him to see the answers to the test on his professors' faces that allowed him to graduate from college, right? So how this African magic, or what I'll call African technology, allows him to successfully navigate the Western world, okay? And then he makes a claim on page 7 that I don't necessarily agree with. And I'm going to read it. Think about if you agree with this or not. Here in the West, I have a great deal of time for spiritual contemplation and study, and much more time to share things of the Spirit with others. If I were still living in my village in Africa, nearly every spare moment would be taken up with scratching a living from the exhausted soil that is all colonialism has left us. Right? So he's saying, because I live in the West, I have the time to spiritually contemplate. I have the time to engage with conversations about the Spirit with others. So I'll ask y'all who live in the West, how much time do you have for spiritual contemplation? Does any of you guys spiritually contemplate?
Yeah.
You do? Okay.
Not much, but I do find time for it.
Do you find time or do you make the time? Because that's a little bit
I
different.
make the time because I'll be sitting down in my car, or I'll be like, I wonder this or I wonder that.
Anybody else?
I was just gonna say, like, I feel like it's not really an issue of time, it's more an issue of cultural importance, because in the West it's not exactly as important to us as it would be to African culture. So we wouldn't necessarily make the time for it, you know?
Being absolutely. And what I would say is, for in the West, when you do have leisure time, right? How is it spent? Watching TV, social media, sports, whatever the case may be. It's rarely relegated to things of the spirit. So my critique of Malidoma's statement is that it's not because you're in the West that you have this time to spiritually contemplate. It's because of his occupation, right? He's an author. He's a spiritual advisor. So by default, he has to do that to be efficient at his occupation. It's not because he's here in the West, right? Yes, I understand that in Africa, it would be a little bit different because of colonialism's extracting all the resources, but not by and large to you being in the West is going to allow you that time for spiritual contemplation. I also bring this up for you guys as scholars. It's a good practice to be a critical scholar, to read something, automatically disagree with it, and then intellectually work your way to see if you can agree with the claim or not. That's being critical, right? Don't just accept something as true because it's written in the book. Think about it, contemplate it, grapple with the idea, right? He lays out his thesis very concisely on page 8. He says, what I'm attempting to share with you in this book is only one of the endless versions of reality. So implicitly, what that says to me, the Dagara believe that there's multiple versions of reality, right? And if you read closely, Malidoma tells you one of the conduits to reality or to your understanding of reality is language, right? So the English language produces a certain type of reality, right? Spanish produces a certain type of reality. Tagalog species produces a certain type of reality, right? Swahili produces a certain type of reality. Because he says, right, there's no concept for the supernatural. They don't have that idea, that word, no concept for the supernatural, because things that we perceive as supernatural in the West is natural for the Dagara, right? And he goes on to say that there's a close connection between thought and reality. To imagine something, to closely focus one's thought upon it, has the potential to bring that something into being, right? So to think about something, to closely focus on something, could manifest that thing, right? So in the early 2000s, there was a documentary that came out that had a lot of attention called The Secret, right? And they kind of birthed this phenomenon or this movement called science of the mind. And in The Secret, what The Secret was is what you think, and if you think about it enough, and you speak on it enough, and you act on it, then it will become real, right? This is the secret. But it's not a secret. African people have been doing this since the beginning of time, right? This is a natural African science. But what the West has done has captured it, repackaged it, and called it science of the mind or new thought, right? But he's telling you like, yo, we've been doing this forever, right? And then he does this experiment with Star Trek. So he gets a little TV, he gets a generator, and he shows his elders Star Trek. And what's interesting is this. He says Star Trek is the West vision of the future. So how the Western world views the future is what Star Trek is, right? But for his world, the things in Star Trek are normal. Spock ain't nothing special. That's a cotton blade. He's just too tall to be one of them, right? The ability to travel through space and time, we do that all the time. That's no big deal. You don't need a spaceship for that shit. Tap into your mind and you can travel through space and time, right? So then he makes the claim, the irony that the West sees the indigenous world as primitive or archaic. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the West could learn to be archaic as my elders, right? So it's a critique of the West. You calling us primitive, but what you view as your future is our present day reality. So who is really primitive? Who is really archaic, right? Then he makes another profound claim on page 9. He says, it is my belief that the present state of restlessness that traps the modern individual has its roots in a dysfunctional relationship with their ancestors, right? And I thought about that. And what it made me do was think about a lot of indigenous cultures, right? Indigenous culture here on this continent, what we may understand as Mexican culture, El Salvadorian, Central American, et cetera, right? They have a strong tie to their ancestors. If you think about the movie Coco, right? All that movie is about is respecting and reverencing your ancestors, making sure your grandma stays up on the altar, right? He talks about in the book, in Asian culture, when someone was to be king, right? Before they took the throne, they had to go in the temple of the ancestors and sit and get guidance, right? So it shows you there's a strong connection to the ancestors. In African culture, in my house, we have an ancestral altar, right? We do rituals on a monthly basis to the ancestors. I place a bow at my ancestral altar. I make sure that there's food there for them, right? Just to reverence their presence, to ask them for guidance, right? But in the West, that doesn't happen. They don't have that reverence for the ancestors. And finally, we'll close it out with this. I'm going to ask you before I read this, what is alienation? What is alienation? Someone define for me alienation.
Alienation means to be like exiled or to be like alone.
Yep. To be isolated, to be alien, right? Hence alienation. So he says, alienation is one of the many faces of modernity. Okay? When you hear this term, modernity, is two ways to think about it. One is the simplistic way, right? It's the modern. So right now we exist within modernity. We're in the modern world, okay? Another way to think about it from a historical epic standpoint is when when the European world becomes world power, right? So when the Greco-Roman Empire takes over and becomes the world power, that's the start of this iteration of modernity, okay? So alienation is one of the many faces of modernity. The cure is communication and community, a new sense of togetherness. By opening to each other, we diminish the pressure of being alone and exiled. So to me, this is the big thing. This is the big point. And this is the thread that you find between the teaching of Ptah-hotep, the readings on Ma'at, and this reading that we did this week. This idea or this notion of relation, right? This new sense of togetherness. This new communication in this new community, right? The meter nefer, the good speech, that's the new communication that he's talking about, right? We're going to speak to each other in a way that's well, right? This new community is going to honor and respect each other by the way that we treat each other. So this notion of relation becomes central to not only the ancient Kemetics, but to Malidoma and the Dagara society also. So those are my notes for the reading. Let's transition into the fishbowl. Remember, for your fishbowl, you can either read from your journal, you can use what was talked about in your breakout rooms, or you could talk about what I mentioned in my notes. Is there any volunteers for the fishbowl? Any volunteers? Okay, so I'll call on some people. Remember, you do have one time to pass before you can go. Okay, Monica, you'll go. Anyone else want to volunteer before I start calling on people? All right. Ramon, are you ready for fishbowl?
I ain't gonna lie, I'm not ready this week.
Okay. So remember, you used your one pass for the semester. Carla, are you ready to fishbowl? Carla Sanchez, are you ready to fishbowl?
No.
So you used your one pass for the semester. David, are you ready for fishbowl?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, David. Maria, are you ready to fishbowl?
Not really.
All right. Ashlan, are you ready to fishbowl?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll go with you three today. Thank you. Also, if this is your second time, let me know so that way I can stop asking you to fishbowl, because if you did it twice, you're good for the semester. Monica, David, and Ashlan, you guys are our three fishbowls today, so whoever's ready can start us off.
I'll go first.
Okay.
So I'm gonna read something. I'm gonna read from my journal. So Maladoma believes that even if you're living in a different country, you should never forget where you came from. He grew up in West Africa, where he was later kidnapped to be taken to a boarding school. He ended up going back to his people, where they give him a talisman to help him on his journey to get into college to be able to get his degree. He was shocked to learn the news of getting the interview and giving him his full ride scholarship on the spot. He ended up with a bachelor's degree in sociology, literature, and linguistics, and a master's thesis in world literature. He used his method of looking at people's auras to get answers to exam. He didn't like when people looked at him weird because he was wearing his tribal outfit, and it was new for people to see someone that wasn't with a suit and a tie. He always carries his medicine bag, but during certain situations, it's embarrassing for people to see it. When he presented his book to an audience in Virginia, he was scared and nervous that people wouldn't like what he was saying, but he was amazed when everybody stood up and clapped for him. He thought about how both worlds benefited him. He learned so many skills where he was able to apply to his daily life. I can definitely relate to this today because many people I meet are very happy with their backgrounds. They are glad that they are able to speak two different languages and use that as an advantage as their skills, and that they're able to celebrate so many different traditions in their life. And a question that I had was that if was there any specific hardship that was constantly on his mind when he was living in the West?
Good question. It's a good question, Monica. Who's next?
I can go. A quote from the book I have is, "But I never lost my Western education, so I am a man of two worlds, trying to be at home in both of them, a difficult task at best." And like what he also talked about was that it was hard for him to fit in when he went back home, and he basically had to blend in to go back to his old reality. And sorry, I'm trying to read from my notes.
Okay, take your time.
Oh yeah, I wrote that like when you're taught something, I guess from like what you were, I don't know how to word it, sorry, but it's difficult to adapt to both of the realities, from one you were kind of born into and then one you're like, I guess, taught in. I don't know how to like word it.
Socially brought into. I got you.
Okay, but I feel like this system is still like used to this day, like in schools and stuff. How like in schools we normally learn about like, you know, European history and stuff. So I guess history does like replay itself. And when like I guess those type of topics or situations happen, we're pretty much unaware of them, I guess. So, yeah.
Thank you, Ashlan. David, you're next.
All right, so I should basically say what I said. I just wanted to rephrase on what she said. I do see that as she said, history tends to repeat itself, and it's not just so much that we repeat itself. As humans beings, we are capable of able to learn from the past, and quite frankly, throughout the whole future, throughout even from our past, we look further beyond that. We still see history repeating itself. Simple fact. World War One, we didn't learn and we went to World War Two. Simple as that. And as they were stating throughout this whole pandemic, before there were epidemics and pandemics that happened, and yet people were doing the same thing, going against the mask, going against the medicine that was already provided for us, to prevent all of this, to end all of this. And yet people back then in the 1920s with the flu still refused it all. And what are we living now in present day? Many people have their opinions about this virus. And as she said, history does tend to repeat itself. And then one question I did have is, then if we are human beings and we are so capable and we have this, we are able to critical think, which separates us from animals, then why haven't we been able to progress throughout the years?
That's a really good question, David. And I think, so for me, I would respond to your question with the question of what does progress look like, right? Because one would argue that we have, right? And I'm not saying I disagree with you, but I think the definition of progress is important for your claim, right? Because how you so choose to define progress will determine the accuracy of your claim. But I agree with you. Thank you guys for the fishbowl. That went really well. What is really prevalent in the fishbowl conversation is the notion of two worlds, right? And W.E.B. Du Bois, he used the term of double consciousness. And he says for black folks, right, it's like two individuals within you that are warring, right? You have your understanding of the black world and of blackness, right? And then you have the way that the white world sees you. And that also is kind of at play within your understanding of who you are. That could also play out for those who are bilingual, right? You speak, let's just say, for example, Spanish, there's a whole different world that comes with that language. And then there's a whole different world that comes with English. And oftentimes you're torn between those two worlds. For black folks, right, we may not be bilingual in the sense that we speak a whole entire language, but we do have what's called Ebonics, or what's called African American Vernacular English. Ashlan, can you say that out loud, please? What you put in the chat?
Oh, I asked if code switching plays a part in that.
Can you define for the class what code switching is?
I don't know like the proper definition, but I guess speaking a different way, like if you're with your friend, you would talk a certain way, and then if you're with your parents or like a adult or something like that.
Yeah, like putting on your professional voice.
Yeah,
and things like that. Yeah, it's code switching. Actually, that absolutely comes in play. So essentially, what code switching is a survival mechanism that people come up with to navigate the two worlds, right? And that made me look like, speaking Spanish at home, but not speaking Spanish at school or in the restaurant or in the grocery store, whatever the case may be, right? It may look like having a very ethnic sounding name like Amiri, but using Adam instead because that may give you more job opportunities, right? So implicitly within this idea of code switching, or implicitly within this notion of existing within two worlds, one world takes priority over another world. And oftentimes, that Western world is the world that takes the priority, right? And that's why you have to do things like code switch. But what happens when, like, the world that you come from gives you things that can be beneficial in the world that you're going to? For example, Maladoma's talisman, right? So this is an African technology that he's gifted that allows him to navigate the Western world. In fact, he says, I didn't even go to class when I was in college. I hella ditched class. But when the time for the test come, I have my talisman on me. I seen what the question was on the test, and I would look at my professor's face, and his aura, I would be able to get the answers to the test, right? So this is an example of this African technology that has no place in this Western world being beneficial in this Western world. What are some other examples of indigenous technology that can be beneficial in this Western world? Let me ask you this. Are there any advices that your parents, grandparents give you that may help you navigate the Western world? Is there any advice that your abuela gives you that helps you navigate the Western world, right? I know for me, growing up, it's always this notion of, well, if you're black, you have to be twice as good as everybody else to get your foot in the door, right? So this is a knowledge that was instilled in me by my grandmother and my mother that helps me navigate this Western world, right? Also could be recognized as a term called funds of knowledge, right? So have any of you received any funds of knowledge from your ancestors, from your elders, from your relatives that help you navigate the world that you're currently occupying?
I would just say like one of the things that my mom like most prevalently like stressed on me was like to not let other people know your plans when you're still in like the workings of it, because they'll just like come in and like steal it, you know? Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a whole word right there for sure. Anybody else?
I would say being bilingual, always remembering the Spanish language because I feel like a lot of jobs prefer it if you speak both English and Spanish. Yeah.
Yeah, especially in California, right? Like maybe if you're back east somewhere, it may not be as much of a priority, but definitely here, that's something that would bode well for you. And that's why I kind of liked what Monica was saying in her fishbowl, because she was like, being bilingual kind of allows you have access to both worlds and be able to function fluently within both worlds. And I think it's really a shame that by and large, right, when you look at schools and things like that, we don't recognize people who are bilingual as having superior intelligence, right? In fact, we'll say that bilingual speakers are maybe less intelligent than those who just speak English, right? And like, what sense does that make? How is it that somebody can speak two languages, can think in two separate languages, is less intelligent than somebody can only speak one, right? And to me, some of the trick bags that we get caught up in by prioritizing the values of the Western world. What are some other thoughts that you guys had about the readings? Paris, what was your thoughts on the readings?
Hi, Professor. Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead, Jesse.
So what I wanted to talk about was what we were talking about earlier about how he feels more safe or more more safe to express his culture here in America. And I think it's just important to have a good balance of both, because he does mention having a balance of his spirituality and his culture. So I think I think when we just kind of make friends or acquaintances, they kind of show us like for example, like being Hispanic, they kind of know I get like a culture from both, just the way that I am, the way that I maybe the things that I eat, and the way that I like, obviously being bilingual. So I think it's good to just have a balance of both. And I do believe in the code switch of like when you have to be professional and when you have to like when you're able to hang out with your friends. There's just a certain standard, the way that you have to present yourself. So I think it's important having a balance, but code switching, I feel like it is a necessity if unless you're like professional all the time, but I don't think that'll be the case for everyone. So I think there's like the just balance is like a very like broad, but at the same time, like there's so many instances for it in this case.
Okay, so actually, Jesse, thank you, because that's a great transition into your homework for this week. So Jesse says code switching is a necessity. It's a means of survival, I say, right? And it's important to have this balance. You want to be professional in a professional setting. So your homework is to not code switch. So if there's a certain time where you don't speak Spanish, I'm going to suggest you try to speak Spanish and see what happens. If you have your work voice that you use sometimes outside of work because you think that this is the appropriate way to engage certain individuals, right? Don't do that shit. See what happens. This is your homework, and we're going to talk about this next week. This is why this homework assignment becomes important. This is why I talk with you and I engage you guys at the capacity that I do, right? I could very well come up here and use all these philosophical terms and talk professional to you. I could do all that shit, right? I read enough that I could have that type of conversation, but I choose not to. Because it's important that we as marginalized groups feel comfortable in being our full, authentic selves wherever we go. It's important that we as marginalized groups feel comfortable being our full, authentic selves wherever we go. Because we'll get in the habit of telling ourselves these narratives that the way that I talk isn't professional. My last name, Manzili, is too ethnic. That won't give me job opportunities. They don't want to hear me speaking Spanish. This is an English-speaking country, so I better speak English. These are narratives that we tell ourselves to self-impose colonialism. What does that mean, to self-impose colonialism? What does that mean? To self-impose. What is colonialism?
Is it the practice of domination?
Yep, absolutely. So colonialism would look like you're at home. I come to your house. I say, you know what, Ashline, your house is now my house. All the food in your refrigerator, that's mine. When you work, you bring that check home to me. If I'm hungry, you better go make me a sandwich. You make sure that my yard is kept up, right? So essentially, is a foreign entity coming into your home and occupying and taking over your home, right? So what I'm saying is, you are self-colonizing when you participate in this notion of code switching. You're saying that your innate self has less value than the professional or the Western world, right? This is what I mean when I say that. So I'm telling you, and I'm encouraging you to place value on your indigenous self, to place value on your innate self of how you came out the womb. That's important. That's divine. That's how the Creator made you, right? But what happens is you get socialized into not placing the proper value on your divinity. So try it. Now, I'm not telling you to get fired. I'm not telling you to get your ass whooped. So be smart about how you go about not code switching, right? But try it. But be attentive to how you feel. Most importantly, does your spirit feel lighter when you do that? Right? If that's the case, then you know you're along the right path, right? But also be attentive to those around you and how they respond. Because in my experiences, I found one of two things happens. Either one, the people who get uncomfortable, right, and have a problem with my true authentic self, they reveal to me who they truly are. I would say that again. They reveal to me who they truly are if they're uncomfortable with my true authentic self, okay? The other thing that happens is the other people also get comfortable, right? So how I talk to y'all in class, when I was a student doing my Ph.D., I used to talk to my professors. I used to address the class the same way, cussing all that shit. I did not change who I was, not one bit, right? And what I found was, the beginning of the semester, I'll have a black professor, and he would be a little buttoned up, and he'll say all the right professional ideological language, right? But about 2 weeks in the semester, after I get done talking, he starts to kind of get a little bit more comfortable. She starts to get a little bit more comfortable. She starts to speak the way that she normally speaks, right? So you'll be surprised how you being yourself can change the environment that you walk into. And that's your divinity. So that's your homework assignment. Your second homework assignment. And this leads back to this conversation on purpose, right? Because the Dagara believes that every individual was brought to this planet with a purpose. For them, your name insinuates your purpose. But I say those talents, those gifts, those attributes insinuate your purpose. So I encourage you to spend some time in spiritual contemplation on your talents, your gifts, and your attributes. And think about how those talents, those gifts, and those attributes can move you to fulfilling your life's purpose. Because again, for me, it's not about the grade, right? You'll get your grade, but that's not my overall concern. My overall concern is tapping into that ka, right? Tapping into the real you, that spirit that's you. And that spirit has a purpose. And if I'm doing my job correctly, I'm going to help move you closer to fulfilling your purpose. That's what my purpose is, right? I did the work of doing my spiritual contemplation. I analyzed my gifts, attributes, and talents, and I found my purpose. My purpose puts me in front of you guys, right? And I'm not saying that my purpose is to be a professor. No, that's just the manifestation of the purpose. My purpose is to help you to find your purpose. So spend some time thinking about those gifts, those talents, and attributes. Think about how they can help you to fulfill your purpose. If you are able to find that purpose, then your task becomes to live in that purpose, to fulfill that purpose, to not let anything distract you or make you waver from that purpose. And that becomes not only your assignment for this course, but the assignment for your life, right? And if you think back to the teaching of Ptah, he tells you to always follow your heart. And that heart is telling you and guiding you and giving you insight into what that purpose is. And I promise you, as real as I am before you, once you start to live in your purpose, watch how doors get opened up for you. Watch how your name will be on lips of those who will take your name into rooms that you've never even been in. Watch how the ancestors will clear your path so you could walk straight and fulfill your purpose. But we are so distracted from everything else in this society that we don't even know we have a purpose. So this becomes your assignment for your life. Your assignment for next week is to not code switch and see what happens. I'm curious. Give me some feedback as to how you guys feel about your homework assignment.
I think it's kind of like either spiritual and even like a good life advice, because I feel that it would bring a lot of benefits to it. And I like it.
Anybody else?
I feel good about it. Oh, sorry.
I think it's gonna be a little bit hard for me because I have like a professional thing, and then I like a different persona when I hang out with my friends. So
try to blur the lines a little bit. Try it. Again, but be smart about it, but try it. Jocelyn?
I was saying I feel pretty good about it because like we had spoke on before, like it's something that I like to do a lot.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just like it's something that's a part of my everyday life, and like the way that you're encouraging other people to bring that into their lives, like I think it's a great thing, and they'll probably learn something out of it.
I mean, Jocelyn, you could probably speak to this. It's a liberty in just being yourself all the time. It's a freedom that comes with that that's really hard to replicate.
Yeah, and it's like, I don't know, it's just like a really good form of being like content with yourself in the society that you're in, because we tend to like you said, we tend to follow the social norm of like, where we live, the areas that we're in, and it's just like people are all different. We're all different types of individuals. So, kind of exploring that and being yourself, it's a good thing.
Absolutely. Okay, real quick, I'm going to